Hello, my name is Evan Reynolds. I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow in the NeuroNetwork for Emerging Therapies here at the University of Michigan. And I'm here to discuss our study, Neuropsychological Outcomes in Individuals with Type 1 and Type 2 Diabetes, which was recently published in the Frontiers of Endocrinology. So we know that patients with diabetes already experience conditions such as retinopathy, neuropathy, nephropathy, and stroke, which are debilitating conditions that reduce quality of life and increase morbidity. It's much less understood whether these patients ultimately develop neuropsychological outcomes, including mental health disorders, cognitive disorders, chronic pain, addiction, and sleep disorders, compared to patients without diabetes. And this is really important because if these patients are experiencing these neuropsychological outcomes at a higher rate than patients without diabetes, it's really important while we care for these patients to prevent, treat, and ultimately screen these patients for these conditions. This study aimed to address these questions using a large representative database of privately insured individuals in the United States. So we found that patients with type 1 diabetes had a higher prevalence of microvascular and macrovascular complications compared to patients with type 2 diabetes. And both patients with type 1 and type 2 diabetes had a higher prevalence of microvascular and macrovascular complications compared to those without diabetes. In contrast, we found that patients with type 2 diabetes had the highest prevalence of neuropsychological outcomes, followed by patients with type 1 diabetes, and then patients without diabetes. Importantly, our logistic regression models found that the presence of microvascular and macrovascular complications was associated with an increased odds of having each neuropsychological condition. We also found that after adjusting for the presence of microvascular and macrovascular complications, patients with type 1 diabetes actually had similar odds of neuropsychological outcomes compared to those without diabetes, suggesting that for patients with type 1 diabetes, having microvascular and macrovascular complications is a key driver for ultimately having a neuropsychological condition. And specifically, we found that the macrovascular condition of having a stroke and the microvascular condition of having neuropathy seem to play a critical role in developing these neuropsychological outcomes. And so future research really needs to dive into the underlying mechanisms that may cause these neuropsychological outcomes to occur in patients with diabetes and microvascular and macrovascular complications. For patients with diabetes, really our study was the first to demonstrate that these patients likely have a higher prevalence of these different neuropsychological conditions. And so when we care for these patients, our study adds to the evidence that we need to be careful to screen, prevent, and also treat these different neuropsychological conditions in patients with both type 2 diabetes and type 1 diabetes. And specifically, we find that preventing these macrovascular, microvascular complications can severely reduce the risk of ultimately developing neuropsychological conditions.